Before we proceed with the presentation of experiment number 5, we have to address one problem. What are the minimum and maximum, the amplitude, of the VCO signal? We showed how we can measure the frequency of the VCO signal using a counter as frequency divider, even though the VCO signal has a higher frequency than it is possible to properly display on the TopNotch meter. The TopNotch meter is also capable to estimate the maximum and the minimum of the VCO signal. All that needs to be done is to use a probe 1 cable on channel 1 set to probe 1 and record the minimum and maximum. We are going to present a few examples using an external signal generator. So as you can see here, we have 600 millivolts peak to peak and 100 millivolts offset, and looking at the TopNotch meter, we should see a minimum of minus 200 millivolts and a maximum of 400 millivolts. So once again, minus 200 millivolts and a maximum of 400 millivolts. The next example (500 millivolts peak to peak amplitude and offset of 200 millivolts. We should see on the TopNotch meter a minimum of minus 50 millivolts and the maximum of 450 millivolts. Finally, let's look at the last example. So we have 300 millivolts peak to peak and the offset is 300 millivolts. And when we look at the TopNotch meter, we should see a minimum of 150 millivolts and the maximum of 450 millivolts. This shows the TopNotch meter can capture the maximum and the minimum of a 610 kHz wave, even though it cannot properly display it. In experiment 5, we use an iPad mini to provide an audio signal to an AM modulator board. The AM modulator board also receives a carrier from an AM carrier board developed in experiment 4. The AM modulator board uses these two inputs, the carrier and the audio signal, and sends them over the air using modulation. A long wire antenna is connected to the AM modulator board to radiate the signal, and an external radio is used to capture and test the broadcasted signal. Before listening to the tones generated by the iPad using the external radio, we have to check two test points for validity. The iPad signal, as it appears on the AM modulator schematic, must have 1 kHz frequency and about 8 volts peak to peak. So, as you can see, the yellow signal is a sinusoid of 1 kHz with about 8 volts peak to peak amplitude. This is checked with the TopNotch meter. The VCO signal, as it appears on the AM modulator schematic, must have sufficient amplitude to allow modulation, around 250 millivolts peak to peak. As we discussed, the VCO signal is not displayed properly because it has a high frequency for the TopNotch meter, but we can measure its maximum and minimum. So we can see the maximum is about 200 millivolts and the minimum is about minus 70 millivolts. Let's now turn up the radio volume. Let's turn up the radio volume and listen to the tones. And let's change on the iPad a different tone. This is a 2 kilohertz tone, and this is a 1 kilohertz tone. Let's wait for this advertisement to finish. Okay, and now we can have 2 kilohertz and 1 kilohertz. It looks like everything is working properly, and soon we will be able to listen to music.